different topics within the Seventh-day Adventist Church and discuss them with a group of experts. My name's Ken Wetmore. I'm happy to be with you. And we're going to go find some people and ask them some questions about tithe. Let's see if we can find some people. What is the definition of the word tithe?
The definition of the word tithe?
10% of your gross income.
Giving what belongs to God. Give it back to Him. It's His, not ours.
Probably when you give money to the church or donate money, I guess, maybe.
It's returning a portion of income to God.
That is giving a tenth of the total of what you make back to the Lord.
Tithe, as I understand it, is money that we return to the Lord.
It's what God asks us to give to Him, give back to Him.
How much of the money that you earn is God's?
Well, that's a tricky question because you led me up with the tithe and you expect people to say it would be the 10% is God's, but actually all the money that we make is God's money. And it all belongs to Him.
All of it belongs to God. He trusts us with it, and He gives us a choice to give back the 10%.
All of it.
All of it is His. But He's allowing us to use what He wants us to use.
All of the money is God's money.
10% he says to give back to Him, but all of it's His.
What's the difference between tithe and offering?
Tithe is something that you already give to the church, probably. And offering is when you offer more money, I guess.
Tithe belong to God. Offerings belong to God. And the offering is what?
It's voluntary.
Volunteer to give back to Him.
Tithe is the 10% that belongs to God, and offering is your free will, the extra gift that you want to return to help with the different programs that the church offers.
An offering is like a free will gift of what your heart feels like giving on top of the 10% of tithe that you give.
Tithe goes to support His work. Offering is a gift out of the love of your heart, in the sense of when God does something good for you, when you want to give back to Him.
Tithe is the money that God has asked us to return to Him, whereas offering is money that we choose to give to Him to show our gratitude or our thankfulness for what He's done for us.
Offering is what you can give above tithe, and it can be for many reasons, just to show your gratefulness to God, your thankfulness to Him.
What are some things the Seventh-day Adventist Church uses tithe to pay for?
Well, what I've always thought was that the tithe goes to pay the pastors.
The
Ministry.
pastors and some teachers and educational purposes.
Pays my salary. And it pays for things like camp meeting, and it pays for the general conference and starting churches.
Maybe helping the school if they have a school.
Tithe is used for furthering the gospel, to help employ ministers, to minister to us in churches, to provide the framework for our denomination as far as to provide evangelistic outreach, things that a local church couldn't do by itself.
What percentage of Adventists do you think full 10% of their increase?
Oh, I don't know.
That is small. I don't know. I can say a percentage, but probably not many.
I really don't have any idea.
I'd like to say 100%.
I wish it would be 100.
I'd like to say 100%, but I don't know that it is.
Maybe 90%.
80%?
70%, 60 to 70.
Probably maybe 50 or 60.
Roughly 30%.
It's about 28%.
Do you think that tithe monies are used well by the church?
Yes. Yes.
Usually.
Yes.
I think sometimes they are and sometimes they're not.
Yes. Sure.
I do. I think they are.
Well, welcome to our morning panel discussion. We're so happy to have you today, to be here today. As you've caught on, we're going to be talking about tithe with 5 experts. I'd like to introduce them. After I've introduced them, we'll go ahead and have a prayer to begin. Sitting directly to my left is Jerry Reimer. Jerry, would you just briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm the pastor at Gallatin and Hendersonville, Tennessee, and I've been in the conference for about 20 years.
Seated next to him is Aaron McNulty. Aaron, would you introduce yourself?
Good morning. I'm Aaron McNulty, and I have the privilege to interact with this topic every day. I'm the conference treasurer, and I grew up right here, right by Highland Academy, and have been back in the conference for 2 years after starting working here. So happy to be here with you this morning.
Next, we have Dr. David Beckworth. Dr. Beckworth, if you'd just introduce yourself.
I go by David, but thank you. I'm an economist. I used to teach nearby at Western Kentucky University, and I'm a part of this community here in Highland.
I'm Keith Knoll, and I'm the ministerial director for the Kentucky-Tennessee Conference.
And for several years, you were also our stewardship director.
I was stewardship director for 5 years.
So as you can see, we have a great panel lined up for you today to talk to you about tithe. And I hope that what it does is it inspires you. I truly hope that as you listen to this topic, you feel inspired and feel like you understand God's purpose with tithe. So let's bow our heads and have a prayer to begin. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you so much for loving us enough to ask us to contribute to your work. The truth is, you don't need what we have. You're completely capable of creating worlds, and so certainly you don't need our money. And yet, you've given us that opportunity. And so as we talk about this subject today, I pray that it would bring greater understanding, clarity, and inspiration to those who are listening in the audience right now and those who watch this online later. We pray these things in your name. Amen. So let's go ahead and start off the conversation by saying, what are the biblical beginnings of tithe? Where do we see it beginning in the Bible? What are its origins? And from a biblical perspective, why? Don't all start at one time. I guess I could pick on somebody.
I think it was at the time that Lot delivered the family that were taken captive there at Sodom and Gomorrah. And then there was the high priest that he paid his tithes to, Melchizedek. That's the first story that comes to my mind anyway.
Sure. David, you were sharing with me backstage that you'd been reading a little bit of some writings by Ellen White where she actually suggests, Keith is correct, that's the first place that we actually literally see a 10% tithe that begins. But Ellen White suggests it actually began a little bit earlier. You were sharing, this was new to me.
Ellen White suggests that it begins right after the fall. And we see this like in Cain and Abel's story, where they bring, at their first fruits or the firstborn of the flock to be offered. So the principle was there, but tithe was first, the word tithe first comes in the story of Abraham. But the idea was there since the fall, according to Ellen White.
Now, one of the interesting things about the word tithe is that in the original language, it literally means 10%. So when you say the word tithe, you're actually saying 10%. That's literally what it means. So it isn't like at different times that tithe was different percentages. From the very beginning, it's been 10%.
The root word in Hebrew is tira, I think it is, which means 10. So there's no equivocation as to how much it should be. So 10%. I mean, that we get everything that we know about tithing from the Jewish economy, and if it was 10% for them, it probably should be 10% for us.
So let's talk a little bit from a biblical standpoint. One of the places that we see tithing occur is that exchange between Abraham and Melchizedek, that 10% that happens there. But also we see in the in the story of the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, we see some of the Levitical law that kind of explains that a little bit. Could you guys get into a little bit of that, what tithe was used for in that biblical setting?
Yeah, I actually encountered an interesting conversation at one of the churches I preached at recently, because in the last chapter in Leviticus, it describes very specifically returning a tenth of, often back then was their cattle or their grain, their produce. But there's also you may have not planned to go on this, there's also a little section in there where people could redeem if they were in trouble. And so a person came up to me and was like, well, do we do that now? And so that's a whole nother conversation. But
I wasn't going to bring that up, Aaron,
Yeah.
but now that you've done it, well, as a conference treasurer, we can go there.
Let me get back to what I was originally saying. So a tenth was returned, and it's stated clearly there in Leviticus, and as we understand, what that supported was the work of the Levites in the temple and in the sanctuary. So that principle has remained consistent to today, where we live today, as for supporting the work in the, whether it started in the sanctuary and now the gospel work that's going forward now.
Let me ask anybody on the panel who wants to jump in on this, but why do you think God asked us to tithe in the first place? Why was that instituted, Keith?
I think and believe there is nobody more generous, more giving than our God. And he doesn't need our money. He wants our hearts. And the Bible says in John 3:16 that God so loved the world that he gave. Not just that one time, he gives every day. We take it all for granted. My health, my family, my food. He is the most giving being in the universe. And I think he's just trying to teach us if you want to be happy, aren't you happy when you give people your time or you minister to them? He's trying to teach us what real happiness and love is all about. And we're too self-centered, and people are so self-centered that they're wrecking their lives. And so, some people shy away from this subject because I don't want to talk about taking people's money. We're stealing a blessing from them by not sharing them the spiritual principles behind it all.
Jerry?
I think that it was instituted because because of sin, because of the fall of sin, we're basically selfish people. And I was thinking about David Smith the other night, Dr. David Smith. He was talking about pride, and we take pride in having things and making it up the ladder. And when you asked the question, my mind immediately went to Uncle Arthur's Bible story books that I used to read to my children. And one of the stories is about a little girl who got her hand stuck in a vase. And they tried to get her hand out, and finally they found out she had some money that was in the vase, and she was holding it in her hand. She could not get her hand out because she would not let go of the money. And I think that's probably why we have the tithe principle, because that was hers. She found it. She was proud of the fact that she had it in her hand, wasn't going to let it go. And, it comes back to the principle that as sinful creatures, we hold on to everything. Some of us are hoarders. And the principle is to show God made us, therefore we owe him, out of love, at least this small amount that he's asked of us. So.
Yeah, one of the things that my parents really kind of tried to instill in me was this idea that I don't pay tithe, that I return tithe. And I think that kind of becomes one of the real central issues with tithe, especially as you're teaching people who have never experienced tithing before. In many ways, I think people approach tithe the same way that they approach taxes. I've got to do this. If I don't do this, bad things will happen. But that's not really what tithing is about, is it? How do you shift people's perspectives on that? How do you go about changing it from being a kind of a tax to rather seeing it as something different?
Well, I think that's where stewardship time at the church is important. People giving their testimonies, how they gave in faith, and the Lord took care of them. I mean, build the experiences, build the faith up of the people in the church, and then they can participate as well in the experience.
Yeah, I would add to what David's saying, those very real examples of the faithfulness, that faithfulness between God and also his people, some of the most powerful demonstrations of the blessings of it. And I share this, some of you may have already heard it, but this topic became very, very personal for me as a kid growing up, witnessing the example of my own dad when we had some very challenging financial times when he had his health had gone down and the expenses were a lot higher, the income was a lot less, and I was very involved in the family budget, and I wanted to find a way to cut expenses, and we're going to talk about offerings too, but I'm able to share how the Lord was with us all through that time, how he took care of our family, and it was a very real, huge impact on my own life personally. And when we're able to share that with other people, to share how the Lord is always with us, is always with us, and as we trust him and commit our lives to him, that has a tremendous impact on others as well.
I love what's being shared here, and it's all good in telling those personal testimonies and also the stories that are in the Bible. I think about Abraham teaches us a very valuable lesson about our giving God. Take your son, your only son, the son that you waited for, and offer him up as a sacrifice. And I think he was trying to teach Abraham and all of us, man, do you realize what I'm giving in the gift of my son, Jesus Christ? I think that sometimes we have the mentality, Paul Harvey, some of you may remember Paul Harvey, the Butterball Turkey Company set up a line on the radio. People were calling in, how do I prepare my Thanksgiving turkey? They were telling them how to do it. One person called in and said, I've got a turkey that's been in the freezer for 23 years. Is it good to eat still? They said, well, if the freezer was at 0 degrees, you could probably still eat it. The taste and flavor, it's probably deteriorated. And they says, I think I wouldn't really want to personally eat it. And that's what my husband and I thought too. We're going to bring it to church next week. So, we don't want to give our offerings. We bring an offering in the sanctuary times and Bible times. It was without blemish. It was the best. God, you can have the medium strip along the roadway, but the rest of it's mine. We got to change our whole attitude around.
Yeah, I would add stewardship is much more than just tithe. And if the heart's in the right place, you'll see it more than just in money. You'll see it in giving time to the church,
yes,
giving your talents to the church. You don't just show up to church, you're an active part of church. And I think, if you're doing that, chances are you're probably paying tithes and offerings as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. Stewardship goes so much further than just tithe. I mean, it goes to how we treat the environment around us.
Yes.
It goes to so many different things. I think, though, that one of the interesting things about tithing and stewardship is that I think that money and things, particularly in the society we live in today, but I think throughout history, money and things are objects that humans have a hard time letting go of. I think that one of our false gods often is the security of money. And I think that in giving up
trust,
in giving up that 10%, we have the opportunity to show who is the God of our life. Mm-hmm. Who is it that protects us? Mm-hmm. as pastors, we're fond of telling the stories where everything turns out great when we tithe. But I've had those experiences in my life where I've given where I didn't know where I was going to have the money to do some other things later that I needed to do, and God's blessed. There's also been times, though, that I think it's important to talk about where I gave and I didn't have what I thought I needed.
Yes.
And I think that sometimes that passage that we love to quote from Malachi, that I'll open the storehouses of heaven, we look at them from human vantage points of, well, God will pour stuff on me. He'll give me a better house, a better car.
Yeah.
Don't you think that some of the biggest blessings God has for us are not material?
Yes, I do. I would like to capitalize on what you said and what David here said. I remember a homeless person back in Missouri when I was pastoring there, came into our church. I mean, this guy, his breath stunk, his teeth were rotten in his head. You couldn't understand what he was saying. His hair was dirty, he was filthy. And yet I was so proud of that church because they gave him the time of day when most people would be repelled by it. You're talking about stewardship of time or talent or gifts. I had a treasurer in that church. I mean, she was a refined lady. Her husband was on the Chamber of Commerce and different things, city council. You know, not only did people give him the time of day by trying to converse with him, but that treasurer actually invited him home for dinner. And so I'm just talking about not just the stewardship of money, but the stewardship of people. You know, if Gail, what's the guy's name? Garth Brooks. If he walks into the church, everybody go nuts and crazy trying to make him feel at home. But what about a homeless person? You know, when you've done it unto the least of these, and I'm going to really enjoy our quarterly next quarter because that's what it's all about. And that's what's going to finish the work when they see the love of God. And that's what tithing and time and talent, and that's what it's all about. It's all wrapped up together.
David, were you wanting to say something? I thought I saw you.
Well, I was just going to add, you know, it really is, the way I view it, tithing is an expression of your own walk with the Lord. If you're not walking with the Lord, probably you're not seeing the drive, the innate desire to give. And the Holy Spirit will convict you. And so I think it's a reflection of something deeper inside us.
You know, I find it interesting. I've read some books that suggest that, not Adventist books necessarily, but I've read some books from theologians who suggest that tithing was something that was more of an Old Testament thing. It's not necessarily a New Testament thing. And yet one of the more interesting seminars I ever attended, it was at the National Society for Fundraisers many years ago. It was presented by an atheist lesbian, and it was the best talk on tithing I've ever heard. She suggested that she said, I'm not a Christian, I certainly don't like Christians very much, but this is one thing that they have right: tithing. She said, think about how much better the world would be if everybody gave 10% of their income to something that they believed would make the world a better place.
I love it.
So I want to transition out of that into how the Seventh-day Adventist Church approaches tithing. You know, clearly, like I said, this lady said, give to something you believe will make the world a better place. She's not coming from a theological background. From our theological understanding, what is tithe supposed to go to do? What is it supposed to? Is it just something that we do to make the world a better place? So I could spend my tithe to help feed some hungry people or do some things like that.
The Muslim faith, well, you didn't know I was going to go there, did you? The Muslim faith requires 2 to 3% given to the community. And I noticed that on Dave Ramsey's website that a question will be asked, what if I'm not a member of a church? Where should I send my tithe? And he says, well, you should give it to the community, you know, any good charity to give that 10% to somebody. And he doesn't even say 10%. He does to a Christian, but to a non-Christian, you know, just to do like you're saying, to give to the community. But I don't find that in Scripture. It says the storehouse. And the question is, you know, what is the storehouse? And I don't want to open up a can of worms with the storehouse question, but as Seventh-day Adventist Christians, if we understand it as to be to the support of the spread of the gospel and the ministry of the church, then that rules out for me giving 10% to charities or any wonderful fun organization that might be out there. That would come later, because God says, I own the cattle on 1,000 hills, and the tithe is mine. Not United Way. God says it's mine. Don't give it to United Way. Give it to the storehouse.
Yeah, I think that goes to a little bit of when we talk about what makes the world a better place. Hopefully, as Seventh-day Adventists, we believe that the beliefs that we have and our understanding of God is the ultimate answer to making the world a better place. And so to me, that's one of the ways that I like to talk to church members who are talking about, well, I'd like to give my money to this organization or that organization or this. And my question is, absolutely do that, but not with the part that God's asked for. The part that God's asked for is to serve the ultimate good. Love it. Yeah. To bring people into a deeper relationship with Jesus. So let's talk about it. Aaron, can I put you on the spot a little bit? And I'm not putting you too much because you knew I was going to do this. Talk to us about how the Seventh-day Adventist Church uses the 10% of tithe that's returned at the local church. Can you kind of talk about the journey a $100 bill, a $100 tithe bill would make as it comes into an envelope in a church, it's put in an offering plate? What happens then?
Sure. This is when you all get out your notepads and start writing percentages and adding up numbers. No, I will share with you some percentages. It's interesting. I think you'll find it interesting. I'll start though in that if you go back, and many of you probably are already familiar with this, but when you go back to the beginnings of our church and how our church was established, absolutely incredible stories and accounts of how this church started. It was started on the backs of our pioneers who basically were willing to sacrifice everything to get the work started. So you had, ministers. James White, it always comes to mind, where he held a lot of the property and the press all in his own name, and all of his resources were put into that. Incredible stories, and we do well to go back to those stories to see their faithfulness, and it's incredibly inspiring. But with that in mind, as the church developed, there are passages where it's clear that they continue to say we need a structure, we need a system to support our workers, we need systematic benevolence to start supporting our ministers. And so there's a long journey, which I obviously don't have time to get into, but I'll fast forward to where we are currently with our existing structure. And I think that our structure is a beautiful thing in many ways. It's also under attack in certain fronts, and the structure will continue to be discussed. I truly believe until Christ comes back. The existing structure that we have as the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there are pressures that this church will face. I'm just sharing that I believe it will continue to face. But all that in mind, how the structure works within the tithing system, when you return 10% of your tithe, say, I'll just use $1 to make it easy. If you put a dollar tithe in the offering plate, these numbers have been changing a little bit, but in general, 75 cents of that dollar stays in the Kentucky-Tennessee Conference, the local conference of which you are a member of.
So, Aaron, I think this is one of the points I'm sorry for cutting in, but this is one of the things I think is really misunderstood by a lot of church members. When somebody puts $1 in their tithe envelope and marks it as tithe or whatever they mark for tithe, none of that money stays at the local church, correct?
That's correct.
In other words, at the end of every month or whenever, the church treasurer cuts a check for whatever's come in and sends that check, 100% of the money that's been marked as tithe, straight to their local conference. In our case, it would be the Kentucky-Tennessee Conference.
Correct. That's correct.
And so then what you're saying from there is 75 cents of that dollar stays in the Kentucky-Tennessee Conference. And like I said, I just want to really make that point because I know that when I talk to people, even older members get a little confused with it. Well, some of that stays in the local church. No, 100%. It benefits the local church later on, but 100% of that goes on to the local conference.
That's correct.
So 75% then stays, and go ahead and continue where the remaining 25 cents goes.
Yep. Thank you for further fleshing that out. So 75 cents stays in the conference, then the remaining 25 cents goes to the three other levels of the organization of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So if you had that 25 cents, 16 cents of that goes up to the North American Division and the General Conference. 9 cents stays with the Southern Union Conference. And there are discussions right now on how that 16 cents is split between the General Conference, the North American Division, but those are how that dollar is shared between the different levels of organization.
Some of us who are nerdy organization people love getting into all these percentages. I think one of the important things to understand about tithe, and feel free to correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, but our system of tithe is based on biblical principles, but it's not written in the Bible. Is that a fair way of saying it? In other words, our system is based on principles, but it's not necessarily, you're not going to turn to Leviticus 7 and see the exact structure that we currently have. It's based off of the principles found in Leviticus and other places. Is that fair to say that?
Yeah, it's fair.
I was just going to say, I really love our structure compared to Congregationalism, where the money stays right in that one spot. I mean, if you've got a big church like Madison Campus, you're doing pretty well. Or if you've got a smaller church, a 3-church district, you're not doing as well. In fact, they may not even be able to pay, in some instances, a pastor where he has to get a second job. I remember I was driving down the road in Michigan on Route 60, and I was only a mile from home, and a man ran the stop sign off of a rock road or another little blacktop road, and he hit me at 60 miles an hour. He was a Baptist minister, and he hit me so hard that I hit the brake trying to stop the car. I broke 2 bones in my foot, fractured my skull. I'm not blaming him at all, but it probably would not have happened if he hadn't worked a second job. He was working 70 hours a week, fell asleep at the wheel, and I could have been killed. He could have been killed. And that's why I like the structure that we have. Everybody gets paid the same, basically. But anyway, it doesn't matter where you got a 3-church district or you got Madison Campus. It's a very fair way of doing things, I think.
That's, I think, again, an important, as we talk about these things, I want to not gloss over for those of you who may not, if you're really familiar with these terms, that's great, but I want to make sure for those of you who aren't, you understand what we're talking about. Congregationalist churches would be like your non-denominational church that's down, that mega church down the street from you. It's the Baptist churches that are around you. And essentially what happens in those churches is that when tithe and offering are paid, they stay at the local church. And then the local church will decide if it wants to send a certain percentage on to other organizations that they support. But all that money stays in the local church to do whatever ministry they want to do in their local church.
Which is why a Baptist minister that lived next door to me in South Carolina was paid $135,000. The church paid his house payment, his insurance, his vacation, all his kids' education expenses, and it all came out of the local tithe. So sometimes, I hate to say it, but sometimes the call of God in other churches is, how much does this church pay? And to speak to what Keith said, I'm so glad that we have a system which actually came out of Methodism that treats us equal. Go ahead, Dave.
I would also stress the importance of giving at those upper levels, because we are a global movement. And so our tithe is tied into our view of our mission. There's very few other churches that believe we are here for a very special global mission. And there's a tension, how much local focus, how much global focus. And I think it's important for us to remember we are a global church. We're through Angel's message. And things like, Mission Spotlight, growing up, those things help remind us our money is actually being used around the world to fund an important movement.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think that the structure that I believe was divinely given to us, that came about through our church organization, I think it really has been something that's helped our message spread around the world. There are thousands of denominations in the world, but there aren't very many denominations that are worldwide. Most denominations are very regionalized, a country, a part of a country. Our denomination truly is a worldwide denomination, and it's because we haven't hoarded our resources in one place. Somebody said a little earlier, used my church, Madison Campus Church, as an example. We do have a pretty healthy tithe base. If we kept that all at Madison Campus, we would be looking at a different conference, a different way of doing things in this conference, because we would not be able to fund the things in Kentucky, Tennessee conference if all that money stayed at Madison Campus or only a small percentage of it left. And so one of my mentors called it the potluck versus picnic model. If you have a picnic, you eat what you bring. If you have a potluck, it doesn't matter whether you bring a little or a lot, you still eat the same as the other people there. And so that's one of, I think, the real benefits. And at Madison Campus, occasionally we think, man, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this, this, and this, if we did keep that. On the other side of things, the truth is we're able to do a lot of other things in Kentucky, Tennessee Conference, in the North American Division, in the World Church, because we don't do that.
I would mention the other two groups that came out of America that are worldwide movements, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses. They're also very organized, very centralized, and they're the groups that see the growth around the world. So you don't see these independent churches, as you said, spreading messages globally. So our structure, may not be perfect, but it has served a useful purpose at the global message.
I kind of want to jump back to what tithe money is actually used for within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Aaron, what can tithe money, when somebody gives $1, what can that dollar pay for? What can't it pay for within the Seventh-day Adventist Church?
Yeah, it's great, and it's an important question. So, as we've been discussing, the primary use that the tithe dollar supports is supporting our ministers. That's just being fully transparent with you. That's our largest line item, and I'm thankful that that's our largest item, because God set up a system starting in Leviticus that is important that we support our ministers who are carrying out the gospel work. There are other things that the tithe we do use to support. It does support Adventist education. However, there are some percentages that we are not to go over, because that's a whole nother conversation. Adventist education is also under tremendous pressures right now, but we do support Adventist education through the tithe dollar, but not all of it is funded by tithe. So there are those two components. We also, of course, we have this right here, this camp meeting. Tithe is used to support this. We have our youth camp, things that happen out at Indian Creek Camp throughout the year. We have various departments, our publishing department, our youth department, workers in the office that is used to support. I'm trying to kind of go at a 30,000-foot view here. There are things that we do not use tithe for. The primary example of that would be a capital campaign, a building project. Tithe is not used for erecting of physical structures. We don't use tithe for. That's a significant thing that I have to find non-tithe dollars for things such as that. So
when a church is trying to pay their utilities, when a church is trying to put an addition on, when we're building a church, tithe monies don't go towards buildings. They're not used. Tithe money doesn't get used for that sort of thing. So that's one of the things where your local pastors will talk to you about the importance of giving to their offering, to church budget, to other offerings, because local churches, you can't pay your utilities. The conference doesn't send us a check back and say, oh, here, pay your utilities with this. So we really do depend on those extra gifts that God impresses on people to give. And Seventh-day Adventist Church recommends 3 to 5% for church budget, and there are a number of other items that you can give to when it comes to offerings. But I think it's kind of really important to understand that, because one of the huge benefits, Jerry pastors a church. He pastors the Hendersonville church, which isn't too far from mine. Our churches are different sizes, but our paychecks and our benefits are theoretically the same based on our years of service, based on some of those other things like that. And what that means is that I, as a pastor, have no incentive financially to take a church because it's bigger. And within other denominations, that's a real consideration, because, Keith, you were talking about that pastor that hit you. Most of the smaller, and most churches are smaller, and those pastors in those other denominations wind up having to have another job or two.
Yeah, they call them bivocational. So they don't put all of their emphasis into their job as a pastor or their congregation. They have to work to support their family to actually have a living.
And within our church, a pastor may have 2 or 3 churches, but one of the things that's asked of us by the conference is that we not take on other side jobs, that we give our full attention to ministry. And I think that is a huge benefit to churches. I think that amongst Seventh-day Adventist pastors, I think, are some of the most highly educated pastors in almost any denomination, because there's such an emphasis placed on being a professional and to doing the best job that you can for God in the vocation, the gift of being a pastor.
Hey, Ken, I just want to add something. There are part of my responsibility. One of the things that would keep me awake at night is making sure that these people are supported. And there are pressures to our workers. The costs there, as you all know, the economy is, and David can get into this. There are things there are constant pressures. There are things that are going on in our world, and so we do have to look at things. There are additional things that the church looks at, whether it be cost of living assistance, things like that, depending on what area you may be in, that we want to make sure that we are taking care of our workers the best that we can, and so we're constantly looking at that. Just wanted to add that in.
Amen.
Yeah. So one of the questions I'll get asked, and I'd like maybe Keith or Jerry if you'll jump in on this. I'm sure you've been asked this question. So when I tithe, do I tithe on my gross income, or do I tithe on my net income? In other words, when I look at my paycheck, do I pay tithe on what the total income is, or do I pay on what actually goes into my bank account? How do you all answer that question when you get asked it?
I always tithe on Jerry's income. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, that's true. You're in the conference office, so that probably would. No, we all get paid actually the same whether you're in the conference office or not.
I've always tithed on my gross, you know, and I don't. Yeah, everybody has to be convicted, I guess, on themselves. But my wife and I are in perfect agreement that we want to tithe on our gross, whether that's necessary or not. I couldn't.
Why do you choose to do that?
You know, I just think that God has been so good to me. I don't want to be stingy. That's the bottom line. I don't want to be stingy with it. Go ahead.
I think you start creating exceptions, you can go down a dangerous path. I used to live in Texas, which also has no state income tax like Tennessee, and I didn't bat an eye. I'd pay on gross, but they would get you on property taxes, really get you on property. I didn't think twice about that. When I came here, I was working in Kentucky, in Bowling Green, and they had a state income tax and a city income tax. And when I saw my net and gross difference, I about choked moving from Texas. And if I go down this path, I can make exceptions for all kinds of things. Whereas in Texas, I didn't think twice about the property tax. If I start thinking about all the local taxes, sales taxes, I think it's a dangerous path to take yourself down.
Okay, so if I, as an individual, start questioning, looking at how much I make, what should I give, why am I trying to figure out how little I can give God? Because that's what it really comes down to. What tax loopholes can I find with God? I had an elder one time in one of my churches that was also in the military. And he told me, he said, I don't pay tithe on the gross. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, because, you know, all these benefits that I get here, and you don't understand. At the same time, as an officer, I have to buy more expensive uniforms and whatever. And I got to be careful. I almost said his name. But I said, look, we're here. And we were playing golf on the military base that day. Golf was $11. For those of us that play golf, you know, that's a real bargain. And a C-130 landed beside us and went over this road to the landing strip. And I said, you live on this base. You get a break on your housing. You drive on these roads that my tax dollars, as well as yours, are paying for, and you're receiving the benefit of that, and yet you want to squeeze the tithe from God who provides all these things for you. And so I look at it like this. God gives us everything, so everything belongs to Him. And if I get my check and I know that part of it's going to go to Social Security, I could say, well, I'm not going to tithe on it now until I get Social Security. Well, God needs that money now. It's His money. And besides that, when I get my Social Security, if I withhold long enough, you know, I'm going to be taxed at a lower rate, so it comes out even or even better. So the question really comes down to, why do I want to nickel and dime God? It's like if my wife and I are having an anniversary, and I think, you know, she'd really like some flowers. Oh, there's some in the field over there. I think I'll stop and pick some. Rather than going to the florist.
So you're saying your wife doesn't like you to think about what the least you can do.
My wife would be happy with whatever I gave her.
But she also...
Yeah. But
I'm trying to help you.
But when she's an 8-cow wife. Anybody here ever see that film, Johnny Lingo, I think it was?
We're going to find out who the Adventists are here.
That's right. But Johnny Lingo brought 8 cows because he loved her so much. So I want to be like my friend Larry Smith, who I will name, who in the Carolina Conference, we had a program called 10 plus 10 plus. 10% tithe, 10% for the church and its offerings for the local conference, and then if you want to give more. And Larry got to the point where he was actually giving 30% tithe. 30%. But it was because the more he gave to God, the more God blessed him in his business. Yeah. Now, it became such that he actually started playing a game with God, and then he realized, and he told me later, he said, you know, I started tithing for the wrong purposes. So we have to have a balance, but realize that, you know, you can't outgive God. God is, he wants to do the very best for us.
I'll piggyback on what you just said there. You can't outgive God. I really do believe that. When I was out in Washington State, we were at our ministers' meeting. It was at the end of the summer, and a little girl came up. She was cleaning up things, getting ready to go home. She gave a testimony about how Sunset Lake, like Indian Creek Camp, was such a blessing to our youth. And after her talk, she had a powerful testimony. I won't take the time, but she pulled out her whole paycheck for the summer. Sorry. She took out her whole paycheck. She says, I believe in the ministry of Sunset Lake. And she gave her whole paycheck for that summer. And the youth director, as soon as she walked out, the youth director says, she can't do this. She doesn't have the money to do this. When she came, she didn't have enough clothes, enough footwear. We had to go to Goodwill, get her clothes. If anybody needs this money, she needs this money. And so the ministers were moved. We all pulled out our billfolds, and we donated what we could. And I tell you what, she had more money coming from the ministers than what she earned at the camp. God is good. And so, you know, it's a faith factor. It's a trust factor.
So with that said, and David, I really wanted to, and I want to dive into some of the work that you've done when it comes to studying giving trends within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, where things are headed, where things are right now. I asked the question of the people I was interviewing yesterday, what percentage of Seventh-day Adventists pay a full 10% tithe? Do you or Aaron have any idea what that number is at, or estimate? I know we can't know for sure without auditing people's statements, but we usually have a pretty good idea of what percentage are actually paying a full tithe.
I can speak to trends. Maybe if you got a number. You want to...
Well, yeah, it's a great question. What I can say, it's this is a positive thing that I think this conference. I praise God for this. One statistic we do look at in the church is per capita giving. That is the total tithe the church returns divided by the membership in the church. And this conference continues to be one of the highest per capita giving conferences in the whole North American division. And that is a testament to the faithfulness of the people that are sitting in this room right now. We don't have some of these Adventist mega centers in our conference. I mean, we've got some large cities, but a lot of our churches are rural, small churches, and we have some incredibly faithful people. So that is a positive thing. As far as the overall percentage, I don't have the immediate answer to that. I do. But if you look at those per capita numbers, you can get a figure that we've got quite a ways to go to get up to close to even 90%.
There's some demographics tools available to us, and I kind of ran a percentage, and for me, it's what I can tell you based on some of the churches that I've worked with is it's definitely below 50%. In some places, it's well below 50%, but less than half of our church members are actually paying a full 10% tithe.
Yeah, I want to go back to, I think, a first principle. It's the conviction of the heart, what you give. And I do think, if I can put on my economist hat, it is tricky what you tithe. Do we tithe on scholarships? Do we tithe on tuition assistance? Do we tithe on subsidies? Do we tithe on if my house goes up in value? Is it because of inflation or because it's really worth more? There's a lot of complicated questions. I think that's where you have to have the Holy Spirit leading.
Yeah.
And with that said, though, if you look at so some numbers that the NAD, per capita across the NAD, if only we're as good as Kentucky-Tennessee Conference would be great, but it's flatline, so it's about $850 per member from about 2008 to the present. It hasn't really changed much. That's in current dollars. If you look at it adjusted for inflation, giving has actually been falling since the 80s on a per capita basis. So if you look at giving and you look at the amount of income growth in the country per person, they track each other up until the 80s, and then things begin to just kind of downward gradual drift. So there's been a gap between what we could give, that 50% number, and what we are giving. And I've wrestled why. What is it? And I think two things, maybe you can think of more. One is we're just less faithful, be the obvious one. The other one is there's competing ministries. So maybe you're giving the 3ABN instead of the church. Maybe you're giving some self-supporting one. But there is, from a big perspective, there is a growing divergence between what we could give and what we do give.
Is that something that's just seen in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, or is that across other denominations as well?
I don't know.
Okay. Aaron, you were about to...
Well, I just wanted to add, I know our time's running low. I will do this when I'm out in the churches, but couple things I wanted to share. First, I want to again thank you for your faithfulness. This is all a faith journey. Everything that we do is based on faith. And but secondly, I very much want what we do, how we use the tithe. I really appreciate you tackling this subject, Ken. There is nothing that our office hides in regards to that, and so if you have other people that you know have questions, if you have further questions, my office is completely open as to how we use the resources, and if you have suggestions, ideas, I'm always an open ear. So just wanted to share that as well.
I also want to let you know David has actually done a very interesting study on the way that money is used in the church and how much money it takes to make one convert. That number is actually dramatically increased. It doesn't have so much to do with tithing as much as it has to do with some other interesting dynamics within the church, I think.
Yeah, I have one measure I call the Laodicean index. As good Adventists, we know what that means. The number of, there's the money question, but how many members does it take to get a convert into the church? And if you go back, a few decades, it's about 15 members per convert. Today, it's getting close to 40. So, I think the tithing, the offering is a reflection of that symptom. So,
to me, as we kind of wrap up this, and it's funny because I watch we have a little timer down here, and I always look at it and think, man, how are we going to fill the next 20 minutes? And then I get down to having a minute and 20 seconds left and think I've got so much more that I wanted to dig into with you all. But I think one of the things I really would like to leave with the people that are listening to this presentation this morning is that tithing is a blessing. It's not a tax. It's not something that we try to find, like when it comes time to do our taxes, we try to find every loophole we can to try to get away. And the other thing that I always encounter, I ask the question on purpose at the end of my interview, do you think that the church spends the money well? And I think that when you're on video camera, you tend to be more optimistic than maybe what you say behind closed doors about how the church is spending money, because I've heard discussions, people like, oh, the money isn't being used well, it's not this, it's not that. But to me, it's interesting what Jesus' example was while he was here on earth. One could argue that the system was pretty corrupt in his time. I truly don't believe our system is corrupt like that. But even if it were, my job is to give to God what's God's. And then allow him to go ahead and take care of what happens after that. That doesn't mean we don't have a responsibility to be watchdogs and to say things, But there's also the idea that if it's God's money, He's asked me to use it a certain way, then it's His responsibility to take care of what happens after that. And so that's kind of the thought I want to leave with everybody today, is that God's given you the blessing of returning money to Him. It reminds you that you have everything that you have because He gave it to you. And that's a huge blessing of itself. I want to thank each person on the panel for taking the time to be here, to share their expertise with us today. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about something that I think is also really fun. We're going to be talking about outreach. We're going back to that, how many Seventh-day Adventists does it take to make another Seventh-day Adventist? And we're going to be talking about some different creative ways that you can be involved in outreach, different ideas, and we'll have different people on this panel who will be talking about some neat things that they've done. So with that said, David, would you be willing to have a closing prayer for us?
Sure. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for this time together, this time to reflect and think about the blessing of giving that you've given to us. May we take part in this, Lord, and may your Spirit convict us and lead us where you would have us go. Please be with everyone here, I pray in your name, amen.
Amen.